When designing games, it's typically important to know what your overall goals are. Whether it's a specific tone or a style of challenge or a thematic idea you want to explore, it can help refine your approach to building up your game systems. This is doubly true for any sort of simulation game. Since they're typically based on real-world systems, you have to be really careful about cutting away systems people expect to see or simplifying behaviors people will just assume to operate a certain way. The ability to focus design decisions around a goal can help ground simulations, lest they become simulations in the sense that Goat Simulator is a simulation of being a goat. To that end, the original SimCity's goal feels educational, though perhaps more for its developer than its audience. While developing Raid on Bungling Bay, Will Wright famously found playing with the level editor more fun than the game itself. He had also developed a newfound interest in urban planning, having read the works of Professor J. Wright Forrester. In the late 50s, Forrester, at the time a professor of electrical and computer engineering, had tried to build systemic models of corporations to help them better manage themselves, and in the 60s he had moved on to applying the same techniques to cities and urban planning. So Wright, with a newfound interest in city planning and level editing, began experiments that would become SimCity. The resulting game sort of reflected a consumer-approachable system very loosely adapted from bits of Forrester's work. It wasn't an accurate model of the role of mayor or even municipal government, but rather the forces that Wright, and by proxy Forrester, thought controlled city growth. Demand for housing, for jobs, tax rates, zoning laws, traffic, electrical networks, etc. If civilization views everything from the perspective of state power, SimCity views everything through the lens of those dynamic systems, and tries to educate the player on the rough approximation of those forces without having them worry about the actual math behind any of it. And that focus resulted in a game that was at once expressive and educational. Of course, that was 1989. Flash forward 24 years to 2013. The last SimCity game had come out a decade ago, and while over the years SimCity has added complexity to its simulations, introducing things like pollution and garbage collection, the core values have been the same. Incremental improvements aside, at a certain point you're teaching the same lesson about the same half-reinvented model of city growth and decay. Meanwhile, the genre that SimCity had inadvertently created had spawned games that focused on looking at cities from the perspective of traffic, dictatorships in the Caribbean, sci-fi takes on city management, RPG takes on city management, even city management games about heaven and hell. Going back to the well for a straight-up reproduction of the old Forrester-influenced model of pure urban dynamic systems wasn't gonna cut it. It was time for something new. The question was, what? And that is where SimCity 2013's problems begin. SimCity 2013 never seems to settle on that one big idea, that singular focus to drive its design. Instead, it sort of juggles around several ideas, each one sort of in ongoing conflict with the others. The most controversial decision, of course, was to make the game online only. There's been lots of discussion about whether this was done in some half-hearted attempt to combat piracy, but regardless of whether that's true, the high-level game really does seem to be designed to focus on cooperative and collaborative city building, which isn't even that far out there. SimCity 4 experimented with breaking large maps down into a series of interconnecting cities, and this seems like it would be a natural outgrowth in that direction. Imagine being in charge of the region's metropolis where your middle managers come in from the suburbs that are run by your friend, and the policies he enacts in his city might have direct impacts on your businesses downtown. Or maybe your friends could build a major industrial center that slowly drains industrial demand from the other parts of the region, forcing them to focus on alternative economic engines like tourism. On paper, it actually sounds kinda neat. A multiplayer mode in SimCity that allows for an analysis of not just how forces drive city growth, but how different cities and those forces interact with each other. But it doesn't really work like that, mostly because there's not really any reason for your friends to join you. The connection between you and other players is pretty weak. For example, it's not quite clear how other cities are simulated as you play. You'll get notifications when they automatically send a spare police car or fire truck your way, but they're not really being actively simulated alongside your game. It's an online-only game mode that lets you play next to each other, but not really together. You don't share city building responsibilities, you can't establish a council that sets regional laws or tax rates, there aren't any complex resource or border disputes to really be had. In fact, your primary means of communication and interaction with other mayors is the Region Wall, a Facebook-style feed that lists regional events and lets mayors leave each other messages. And it's damning that when you go to the regional view to get advice, the game often tells you to use the region wall to just ask other players to do things. Seriously, like the whole game is built on an online-only multiplayer mode where the multiplayer interaction is predicated on just leaving notes for other players. who are, since the games are public by default, likely just randos, to help you out of the kindness of their hearts by, say, zoning low-density residential because you need unskilled labor. It's an online-only game that features an asynchronous approach to multiplayer that offers little to no player-to-player interaction and no real incentive to work together. And make no mistake, you are supposed to be working together because another of SimCity 2013's design goals are to gamify SimCity a bit. SimCity has long been criticized for its lack of traditional system mastery / win state driven play. It's supposedly one of the reasons that Wright had trouble publishing the game for a few years way back in the 80s. SimCity 2013 takes it upon itself to fix this, as well as align players in a region to a common goal by means of the regional great works. You know, major metropolitan airports, a space shuttle launching pad, an arcology, or a solar farm to provide cheap power to the region. They're not a win state per se, but they function as an implicit win state by being a region-wide goal. They require a ton of money, often require research from a major university that someone's going to have to build, and often require materials that themselves require a business or trade-heavy city to import or a mining city to extract from the earth. It's really difficult for one city alone to build a great work, and so it typically falls upon the region to work together if they want to reap the rewards. So great works become a sort of de facto win state, especially for newly formed regions that have none of them. But when you have a multiplayer mode built on post-it notes being used to facilitate this big, complicated tech tree and resource requirement list, the coordination just isn't there unless you're doing it yourself. One wonders how they expected a public server full of strangers, each trying to build the biggest city in the region, to work together towards these goals. Great works feel too optional to invest in, but too big to tackle yourself. And it's not just the loose-knit multiplayer where they've tried to add more structure. Citizens in town will occasionally ask the player to complete specific challenges, sometimes for a reward. This amounts to having quests in the middle of a SimCity game, and yeah, that doesn't work. Some of them are straight-up tutorial helpers letting you know you can modify buildings, which, whatever. Of the rest, half of them are simply requests to build a thing, so your quest is just waiting until you have the money and then plopping down the thing. The other half don't really require you to do anything. Making sure that garbage gets collected from a party or that your fire trucks respond in a timely manner is more or less just asking you to put your faith in the infrastructure you've built. Cities are just too static to make the short quests engage the player directly. Meanwhile, the game tries to avoid longer or more impactful quests like, say, switching exclusively to wind power, because that might ask players to go against what they actually want to do with their city. After all, SimCity has always encouraged player expression by its open-ended nature. From remaking your hometown to christening local landmarks to renaming your local sports team, the game has always been about building your city, whatever that means. And SimCity 2013 tries to recapture this a bit. There's a mayor's mansion that you can customize after having high approval ratings for a while, sort of like the throne room in Civilization. And there are also random aesthetic features you can change on the buildings, like the placement of signs and flagpoles. And while I sincerely appreciate the effort, it just feels so inconsequential. The flair worn by TGI Fridays workers is a more meaningful expression of self than where you plop each prefab upgrade, which, by the way, for the mansion have to be unlocked in a specific order, so it's even less interesting than you think. But it's not just that the existing creative outlets are mediocre, it's that the game is newly restricted in ways the previous titles weren't. For example, you can't terraform the land, so you're stuck with the geography of pre-chosen plots. If you do want to rebuild your hometown, I hope its geography is shaped and scaled to one of the prefabs the game comes with, otherwise, Worse, where SimCity 4 offered a variety of interconnected plots of varying size, there is exactly one size. Super tiny. Really, you can fill this map in about an hour or so of play. The size is so small that cities are forced to specialize not because of player choice or economic or systemic pressures, but because there simply isn't enough room to dedicate cities to more than one or two goals. Large projects like universities or airports or theme parks take up a tremendous percentage of your map and choke out opportunities for other growth. But hey, you can always just leave passive-aggressive notes for other mayors if you need stuff, right? That tiny city size is a direct consequence of SimCity 2013's final design goal, what Maxis has dubbed the Agents, Paths, Zones model of simulating the city. Basically, all resources that need to move about the city, cars, electricity, water, sewage, etc., are represented as agents that move along a path, in this case the roads. Zones alongside the path, that is, the buildings, will generate or consume agents of different kinds depending on their needs. So, for example, a power plant will release electricity agents that will flow along the road looking for the nearest building in need of power. As the agents pass over each node, they lose a little electricity until they are consumed. Water works much the same way. Here you can see how one building is thirsty after a shortage and is slowly consuming agents to get back to full stock. This same system, plus or minus some transit rules, drives people to and from work, sewage to treatment plants, and students to school. And the result is not ideal. First, as a system for simulating traffic, it's just bad. People have found issues where agents will get stuck with no ability to turn around and no real target to push them forward. Others have seen issues stemming from the algorithm taking the shortest route spatially, even if it's congested and full of traffic, rather than taking longer open roads. They even had to stagger the opening of businesses just to keep the rush hour clusterfuck to a minimum. This issue is largely unseen in densely populated cities built on grids, which leads one to think that they built and tested this model to support a specific city type rather than a robust and general solution to the problem. Second, while this approach to simulation can be hypnotically beautiful to watch as traffic flows through the arteries of your city, it's extraordinarily taxing on your hardware once you start reaching the upper bounds of agent numbers, which is why the city sizes are so small. Frankly, I'm not sure what we get out of the agents, paths, zones model that a more performant, abstract approximation of these resources wouldn't give us. It's the worst sort of simulation, CPU intensive yet completely divergent from reality, and not in a way that generates interesting scenarios or makes us rethink our assumptions about how to build roads or distribute power and water. It feels like the goal was emergent behaviors, because all the agents travel along the roads they all could theoretically interact, giving you the idea to, say, build a school on one part of town so school bus traffic goes against rush hour traffic rather than contributing to it. But the effects are so small that players lose perceivable consequence, hey, a callback, as to what placing objects one place or another are going to do to traffic patterns. Look, taken individually, these design goals aren't necessarily bad. I like expressive play, and cooperative multiplayer, and experimental simulational models, and system mastery-driven play. But none of them are the core of this SimCity, and thus none of them got the focus they needed to really shine. Worse, all of these ideas work against each other. Creativity is undercut by city size, and the multiplayer's request that you work together instead of doing your own thing. The multiplayer is undercut by the game focusing so much on simulated agents that it can't facilitate meaningful interaction between cities. The agent stuff doesn't work with the creative city layouts and makes some of the in-game quests feel like a roll of the dice. And the resulting city model is so static that it really doesn't facilitate a lot of win-state driven play even in the short-term quests. Because the game lacks a singular focus, SimCity 2013 is a game where systems work badly alone and work worse together. And holy crap, that's 2,300 words on how broken the systems are, and we haven't even broached what SimCity says about, well, cities. This may have to be a two-parter. To be continued?